So here we are in Los Angeles, Venice specifically, a couple of us, Harry somewhere else, wandering the city, and Gabe and I here in Venice, and Harry somewhere else. And we're going to talk about mental obsession, experience, strength, hope in relation to how to deal with this mental problem, which is the primary addiction of all compulsive addictions, all symptomatic based addictions: alcohol, drugs, gambling, sex, food, codependency. All of those sorts of addictive behaviors center in the mind. The mind for us is the brain. The greater mind is a mind that we share. The brain is one that we think for our seeming self, depending on how we're actually thinking about things. And that conflict itself can become a major problem internally to any of us, making believe that it is ourself and there is no other self. There is no other nature to our existence. So one of the things I wanted to mention, I wanted to read the definition of codependence. And that is an excessive emotional or psychological reliance on a partner, typically one who requires support on account of an illness or addiction. And it goes on to say the tie that binds most of us together in this trap called codependency, meaning it's a trap, it's an addiction. Now, our discussion, and this hasn't really been fully baked in my brain, but it's starting to occur to me that the primary experience we're having that's conflicted, or that's possible to have that's conflicted, while we've been talking about a self that's induced by thought and imagined to be real, is in fact a codependent relationship on addiction. So I can't be doing that with that self that I think is constantly out of control, and I need to hem in, and I need to control, I need not to be caught off guard by, to be constantly on guard for that self to do these little mischievous things and do things I didn't expect and can't imagine having happened. That can't be happening if I'm not participating in it. If it's imagined and based in imagination, this is the result of that imagination, not just being imagined, but being thought of as true and real. As soon as I think my imagination is reality, I make believe that who I am is what I think, and that's all I am. So there's nothing more to me than that, and feeling less than would be a natural consequence of that sort of thinking. Feeling conflicted would be a natural consequence of that sort of thinking. It isn't something to get over because it will automatically always replicate, since it's an image of the action I'm taking, the choice I'm making. So I can think about reality, and if I'm accurate, I will be confirmed in any application of that thought. If I'm doing math and I think about 2 + 2 is 4, boom, it works, it works, it works. It will always work in all problems. And problems now don't become problems, they just become equations that I'm able to solve, because I'm no longer struggling over the order of math, the order of operations, and or the steps needed to start to look at the equation as a problem and see the solution. Those things become natural. So if I'm thinking in relation to reality, the confirmation of it is the usefulness of it. The application of it becomes obvious and easy. I don't have to think about it much after that. I just apply it and it works and it works and it works and it works. Now I can also imagine something that doesn't work and isn't real, that's simply imagined. And that's ultimately what I would suggest is the greatest use of imagination, because now we're starting to look into possibilities that we thought were impossible and things that we thought were unreal that may in fact be possible and real, starting to actually look into the world and say, wow, there's maybe more going on here than I thought, and maybe some of the impossibilities I presumed are actually possible, they just haven't been tried, like Orville and Wilbur with flying. Nobody before them tried to do what was apparently happening around us. Birds and other things flew. Even objects flew. They had some ability to be raised up by the wind and carried in the movement of the air. But they decided they were going to figure out what that meant. How do we approach that? So they kept approaching and approaching and approaching. They had an inspired idea that it could happen, that they would make it happen. And so it eventually did. It wasn't because they discovered it, it's because what they did was align with how things actually were, and their inspiration and their thinking, that imagination, which would have been considered at the time wrong by many. They didn't pay attention to what was wrong with it. They were looking for what was right with it. And one of the ways they did it is they created a balsa wood wing, and they had a handheld fan, and that balsa wood wing was on two vertical rods that were allowed to slide up and down. So the balsa wood could move up and down. Balsa wood's very light, and they'd turn the fan. And if the thing went down, they knew that they were doing something that caused an aerodynamic effect. If it went up, they started to realize that's the shape we're after. Kept honing and honing and honing. The shape they eventually created is still used today. Even with all the computer assistance and all that kind of stuff, there's been very, very few. Most of the modifications have been to the tips of the wings, but not the actual size and shape of the wing. So the point is, that's the actual use of imagination. This idea that I can actually consider things that I might think are impossible, but actually simply realize I haven't applied things accurately to notice their possibility. Now, if I'm considering those things that are wrong, and then consider them right, that's where this whole internal conflict begins. Because if something is imagined to be reality, and it is reality, there's no effort in it. There's no conflict in it. It's easy to recognize the confirmation of it by the utilization of it. But if the idea I have about myself, for instance, is only what I think, and that isn't who I am, that's just what I'm making up, what I'm making believe, and I think and call it my makeup, I'm even admitting that I'm making it up and think that the characteristics of it are who I am. So greed and sloth and all the seemingly seven deadly sins, all the internal conflict, the struggle, the anxiety, the stress, the irritability, restlessness, discontent, all of those things are consequences of that thinking. We call them in Alcoholics Anonymous the bedevilments. Prey to misery and depression, inability to have useful relationships, meaningful relationships, and so on and so forth. All of the things that would be called pitfalls. So if in fact I'm making that up, I'm creating a codependency on something that's absolutely not dependent, nor is it independent of my thinking. And so the problems I think I'm having with people in the world are really sourced in the problem I'm having with my own experience, with my own seeming self that isn't myself, is just an imagined self I've decided is real. Because I think my thoughts are real rather than just imagined ideas about reality. And if they align with reality, then I can apply them with purpose. So I never create reality. Big conversation today about we manifest reality with our thinking. No, we actually just interact with reality. And if we're utilizing things properly, we can see results that are actually effective and efficient within reality. That isn't creating reality, it's actually just utilizing reality. It's succumbing to the point that reality is already real and I don't need to create it to utilize it, to take advantage of it. And this other relationship has me feel that I'm being taken advantage of by something I can't control when I'm in fact the creator of it. And that's the insanity of it. So we could talk about that today. Because I have a feeling that this is, I think codependency is a good example of how we think of our relations with others, but miss the relation we're having with the seeming self that we create, that we're codependently addicted to, thinking someday we'll get it right and wondering why other people don't want to abide by our dictates when in fact we're not actually honoring the ones we're creating honestly at all. So that's the preamble. And by the way, anyone listening out there is welcome to join in these discussions. I don't think I've mentioned that or stressed that enough, but I would think there would be great value to have anyone, anywhere who's interested participate for everyone's benefit, just to see the commonality that we share, regardless of where we are, what we're thinking, et cetera, between this potential of a discussion to actually address things in ways that are synchronous and symmetrical and simultaneous in this absolute present state that we all share. If it exists, we share it. So if there's anything absolute, it's something we absolutely all have. It's not a negotiation or an option. So gentlemen, how's the week? How's the day? How's now?
Tired from the time change.
Are you?
No, you talk about like this codependency. It's really strikingly true when you think about it. My always faults with others are really faults with myself. And damn it, it's always me.
Well, my sense though, Gabe, is when you start seeing what you're doing, you actually start to see that there is wrong in the world and start to see that you are and can influence it positively rather than negatively. Meaning if you're actually addressing the issue and it says, if we all share the same commonality, then we all share the same defective, our defects don't have to look the same or be thought of as the same to be central to an idea that we're making believe what we make up is reality. So if we can come to some words that suggest the fundamental conflict, then it would contain all of the different versions that we've created that are effectively perversions of stories that we're telling to make believe we're separate and independent, when in fact the unity of it would be bound by, literally bound by, in the contemptful nature of that thinking, one defective thought. My sense is that it is the fact that we think thinking is real and true, so that any conclusion we come to is necessarily real and true. And now fighting for those things has us think our life depends on it. And you can see in the world that we humans have fought over thought. We've thought in the past or talked in the past, it's over color, it's over who knows what. But basically it all boils down to thought, ideologies that aren't necessarily ideal enough to be assimilated by other people. They seem to be distinct enough to be limited to a certain group, which then thinks their group needs to oppose another group to prove it's right. And that's a sort of metaphoric, broad, macro version of the idea that if I'm struggling with those things, I'm going to find the problems in others to try and make believe that my thought that it's not me doing it are true. So I start pinning the tail on the donkey and forget that I'm actually pinning the tail. I'm the donkey.
You're still an ass.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it isn't even me, it's my choice to act that way as a result of this commitment I have to this idea that it's all who I am, all I am, and as a result, all I can do. And that's basic textbook addiction. I don't have anything to do with it, so there's nothing I can do about it, and as a result, I can only continue to do the same thing. And it's largely what people call me about during the week. It's about their relationships. You know, anyone in Alcoholics Anonymous has a relationship to alcohol. Anyone in Narcotics Anonymous has a relationship to narcotics. Cocaine Anonymous, cocaine. Food Anonymous, and any of the different anonymous food programs. It's food. It's not food that's the problem. It's our overuse, misuse, idea that it's a solution. That's the problem. Food is clearly a solution when it is healthy food is eaten in amounts that are sufficient to serve the nutritional needs of our body, whatever those nutritional needs may be. And we probably all have different chemical makeup in terms of the interaction, and yet they're all based on the same chemical basic potential. So those differences also share a very, very strong commonality because it's something all bodies do. Our experience is driven by chemical interactions in our body. So it's not just the outer chemicals, but the inner chemicals that we're using and abusing when we set off this idea that we are who we think we are, and all of a sudden feel this sort of emergence of an emergency that constantly has to obsessively be maintained by thinking right and defending against any opinion that isn't the same as is ours, and thinking that we're that the idea of self-consciousness, which is defined as undue regard for appearance, which is kind of interesting because consciousness by itself would be a pretty profound thing, but to turn it into undue regard for appearance suggests that we're really worried about appearance, how things seem and how we look, not how things actually are. So I listened to something that Maya Angelou said about anger, and she said, don't be afraid of anger, express it, talk about it, write it down, express it in your painting, express it in your work, get it out, share it. Anger isn't always, when anger is based on my own inner anger that I can't put out, the longer I maintain this idea that it's who I am, and it's all based in what I'm doing with how I'm thinking about what I'm thinking. That builds up, that becomes very toxic because it becomes this stagnant charge in my body. Tension and stress and pressure are all reflections of that. And eventually those experiences explode. There's only so much of it I can take, I admit. And what am I taking? The idea that the thinking is right that's causing the emergency, setting off the alarms, setting off all of the ideas I have about being afraid of the world and less than everything, and scarce thoughts about how things actually are, and all those sorts of consequential thoughts. Any thoughts?
Well, I think for me this week went by relatively smoothly. I know we talked during the week, but um talk about the next right action that we often hear in our program. For me, it was due to the amount of work I have, was able to just go to the next thing, tick that box off, move on to something else, and just kind of go through the day purposefully, the next right action.
Yeah,
But
it sounded, when
in
we
the
talked
past.
about it, it sounded like you were paying attention to what was actually happening.
Yeah, including the things that felt wrong.
Hmm.
They're wrong because they're wrong.
So how did you address that in that process?
I called you.
But you noticed that you were feeling good about the focus you had on the things you were doing that were actually meaningful, purposeful, and in front of you, sort of the actions of the day, the list.
Yeah, but you also realize, I think what I didn't do in the past was if I'm feeling funny or something's wrong, it's because something's wrong, not because my thought is true about it, that I
Right.
didn't get back to that guy, or I promised that person this and didn't follow through. And so the lies and the dishonesty are the actual, though small in relative terms, but promises made and need to be kept, and people pay me for a service and I need to provide that. And so in the past, sweeping it under the rug was a huge uh, way of building up all that anxiety and stress
Yeah.
and waiting for it to explode.
So Gabe, when you're witnessing those things and they seem outsized, like all of a sudden that one little thing you didn't do at some point now has grown to the point where you think it's going to collapse your whole world,
Yes.
you
Yeah.
can see how that pressure building ends up expressing itself, right?
Yeah.
Because if all things are possible, there's a possibility also that that thing you didn't do was somehow beneficial and has some longer term benefit than it would have had you thought the immediacy of paying attention to it was the only thing you could do, and the attention you paid ended up causing a problem you didn't anticipate or expect.
Right.
I had situations in our process, like the building process with the permit guy, is that sometimes the gap in time had him forget things that he was fixated on 6 weeks earlier. That had we pushed him the same day, we'd have been in a quagmire with the guy forever. So sometimes time in that way helps. And the point is, in my experience, if I'm just looking at what I'm doing immediately in the present, I see a lot less of that stuff. And when I see it, if I notice it and start to recognize that it does have a cause, it does have a cause. And if the cause seems so outsized and if I'm so preoccupied with the damage I'm imagining, that somewhere in the book, Bill says we suffer from a lack of proportion, meaning that little things, nothing becomes everything and everything becomes nothing. We can take the absolute state of being and reduce it to absolutely nothing by thinking it has nothing to do with us now because our problems are so big, and we can take a tiny problem and make it so big that it comes to that same conclusion in reverse. So we're capable of that. This isn't to say it shouldn't be done. It's just, my suggestion is, if it's happening, notice it. Just notice those things and say, oh, that's interesting. Don't have to figure out, even when you think you know which thought it is you have that's wrong, I guarantee you there's 1,000 others in there working that have collected over the years, presumptions, cultural ideas that we think are normal, values that we think are valuable, that aren't. But it's easy to see other people doing it and think it's the only thing we can do. Doesn't mean that's true. It just means it's a thought. And to start seeing thoughts as thoughts dispels a lot of the rumors that we tend to maintain to generate the opinions and the conclusions that we need to rationalize and justify that it has some sense somewhere, when generally, if we're struggling to make sense out of it, there is no sense. The senses themselves are not trying to make things up. They're simply interpreting what they're experiencing. Start thinking about our senses that we struggle with. So my experience with the steps is I went from subjectivity, extreme subjectivity in the first step, thinking that what I thought about alcohol was right and that I could control it and I could control and enjoy it. And then I could drink like people I saw who didn't have the need to drink and drink and drink and drink and drink themselves into oblivion, and do it at times that they weren't planning on, or once they started, go places they didn't expect or think they wanted to go. So I was introduced to the idea I'm powerless over alcohol because I'm powerless over the thought I have about alcohol. The thought was a lie, and there is no power in a lie. So the second step, it says, came to believe in a power greater than myself. What is myself at that point if I'm imagining lies are true, but a self that's based in lies? And myself then becomes anything I'm willing to look at beyond that. So objectivity becomes possible because I begin to see the ends of that bubble I'm in of subjectivity as the beginning of everything else, rather than the end of anything or anything else. In either way I look at it. You follow that?
Yeah, I
So
think
we're going from subjectivity to objectivity within the thinking, and we can always play with that. We can always tip that scale back and forth within the mental gyrations we're capable of justifying and thinking about. And that's one way to do it. Certainly possible to feel better about things that are worse and let them continue to be worse. You were on a thread there, Gabe.
no, I was just gonna say I think it's an aside, really. I don't know in those first few days I could comprehend such sentences, but you
It's
always
it.
think you can.
Well, it's interesting that we have great confidence in the subjectivity and the insanity we're maintaining. I mean, think of this. We have great confidence that it's really the only thing we can think about. And during that time, we're really imagining there's nothing else to think about, which is, I think, what you're pointing to. It doesn't mean there's nothing else to think about, and it doesn't mean we don't know better. It means we're acting in ways that give an impression that that's all that's happening for the convenience of making believe that our reality now is all that stuff, that that's our reality and that's all that it is. That's all reality is what I'm thinking. So there's a convenience that's incredibly inconvenient because it continues to perpetuate itself the longer we maintain the idea that we don't know better. And what is knowing better with respect to alcohol? Starting to look at the circumstances and the experience and saying, wow, I've tried this 1,000 times. It's never worked. Maybe something's broken in the thinking I'm doing about it. And the first step is saying clearly, we're powerless over alcohol. But the book is saying disease centers in the mind, alcohol is a symptom, the bottle is a symbol. It's reminding us there's a mental problem. So it isn't that we don't know. The delusion is that we don't know because we think all there is to know is what we're thinking. Now, if I struggle with that 10 years into sobriety, I can imagine that I was pretty sure I had no greater information or knowledge that first day when this occurred to me.
Mhm.
So I can believe in those things, but it's also like saying the early people looking at the horizon were actually right that there was absolutely nowhere to go because everybody believed there was nowhere to go beyond the horizon, and it must be the edge. It must be defining a flat world that has an edge that if you get too close to, you're going to fall off and it's doomed. It was interesting that that thought was pretty pervasive. And those people who thought that then all thought the edge of that horizon was doomed, when in fact it never was, because on a sphere, they just had it wrong. They thought of it as a flat world with an edge. But it wasn't the edge in the flat world in their imagination they were struggling with, it was their idea about it that was doomed. The doom was the immediacy of their own experience. And since we have been presuming that our problems were the effective problems, because we're not what we think in terms of the ideas we have about ourselves, we both claim to only be that self and then claim to be irresponsible for that self. That's a pretty basic breach in the basic construction of responsibility. So the pervasive nature of the day was everybody believed the horizon was doomed, but it was the idea they had that was doomed that they all experienced simultaneously. So that's their knowing. The sense of doom, the misplacement of that doom is exactly what we do when we think it's the people and the circumstances, the situations, the consequences that we're facing that are the problem, rather than starting to see them as consequential to the cause of, they're the effects of the cause in our thinking about our thoughts being real, being true, being absolute in any way. And the only thing that's absolute with thinking is that it's always changing, like change in this physical experience we're having. So it's easy to imagine people don't know better. But if it isn't absolutely true, we are contributing to their delinquency by making believe there's nothing else they can do, because there was a time we thought that too. But if we were thinking insanely, that really wasn't a sane thought. So it wasn't reality, it was imagined reality. And if it's right and we're imagining it, it would be paying dividends. And if it's wrong and we're imagining it, we should see some destructive nature as a consequence, which I think is pretty evident in this whole concept of ego and getting over ego. We use ego incorrectly too. Ego by nature is the I, capital I. I am. That isn't a struggle because we talk about I am thinking to myself. I am thinking about myself. I am thinking about my thoughts. Very different when we turn those thoughts into self rather than see they're simply thoughts I'm thinking about. How can I be those thoughts if I am thinking about them? So how can I become the self when I've made it up by thinking about thinking itself and made believe that's myself or that it's ourself? So if I'm delusional in my thinking, there's nothing there other than a thought that's wrong being thought of as right. And the perpetuation is the desperation that seemed like a bully to continue to pester me into the persistent nature of the obsessive thinking I'm doing to make believe there's nothing else that could possibly be true. So I'm not going to consider anything. I'm just going to follow the fear and base my next step on fear and desperation and wonder why things keep getting worse and desperation continues to grow. shifting, in that description of the first and second step, it's a shift from absolute subjective seeming reality to the awareness that there may be, all I have to do is consider that there may be something greater, some power greater than the thinking I'm doing, than the self I think I am. And we're calling it me then, but it isn't me. It's the thing I am doing to create the idea of a me that seems to be separate from the I. Like people say, I personally, myself, identifying all these different words we use. But the I, having the self, myself, personally, all that kind of stuff is all identifying this other idea we have about who we are. It's our thinking, kind of like thinking a lemon is an orange and then wanting to make lemonade, struggling because you keep getting orange juice. If I'm absolutely convinced that a lemon is an orange, I'm probably going to have a problem with that for some time. It isn't because it's true, it's because I'm struggling with the idea of truth. And if I'm struggling with truth, and truth is absolute, there is no struggle in actual truth, but there's only struggle in imagined truth, in these ideas I have that I set up this conflicted consequence. So the point of that, Gabe, if I'm being taken from complete subjectivity to the 12th step where it says practice principles in all my affairs, it's a transition from becoming objective. Third step, I'm turning my will over to a greater power. What's my will? My choices. My choice to think that all I am is what I think. All of a sudden, I begin to realize maybe there's more to it than that. Maybe this bubble I live in has something beyond it, and I'm gonna turn my will, my choices over to the consideration that that thing is evident, that thing is actual, and I don't have to believe it. Just to start to operate on it, and just say, well, if it is possibly, if it can be, maybe it'll help. I'll go that direction just for the sake of possibly getting help and finding that, yes, there is some help in that. There is some relief in the idea that there's something greater than myself. Again, I'm taken from subjectivity where my back is up against the edge of my limits, looking into the bubble, and that's all I see is me everywhere because if the image is in the interior of a bubble, it's convex, to seeing that the exterior is also no limit can be a limit without having something unlimited beyond it, starting to see that. So I can take a moral inventory for a step. What's moral? Not the immorality that I've been perpetuating about the self I think I am. It's starting to say, here's the defective nature of that thinking. Here's how it got to me. What do I talk about? Who, what, where, how? All those things I'm talking about. What's the impact on my experience based on the ideas I have about other people and largely based in resentments? Things I carry along as things that shouldn't have happened, that affected and actually hurt that ego that I had as self because they were thoughts contrary to mine. They didn't do what I wanted. They did it in ways that I didn't expect and didn't want. They betrayed me and all that kind of stuff. When the betrayal is actually the self I've created. And what's the fourth column? Responsibility. For what? All of it. 100%. And that's ultimately forgiveness. I have things as they are. I have no unforgiveness. I simply allow them to be. Even the decrepit nature of dysfunctional thoughts, if I have them as they are, there's no fight in them at all. They dissipate. Start to basically do what they actually are rather than seem to be what they aren't. And then the fifth step, we talk to somebody else about it. That talking to somebody else doesn't mean find somebody you can always talk to and never talk to anybody else. It's an introduction to the idea that we can always talk about these things openly. And yet socially, we don't do that very well. We struggle. To admit I might be acting insanely is not a high point. It's kind of like admitting I was an alcoholic. I thought I was much happier to admit I was a drug addict in the days, in my days, because I grew up, my teenage years were spent in the 60s, and it seemed like a worthy rebellion to do drugs. Shitting and pissing and vomiting in the curb in the street was not that appealing as an alcoholic. And yet I drank like one, certainly. I qualify. So 6 and 7, we're moving in that direction of beginning to have these things removed. And ultimately, it isn't a God that's taking them from us. Ultimately, in the absolute sense, it's realizing that God never put them there. God never saw them, that insanity was something I was creating. And even the willingness to begin to let them go, they begin to dissipate because I'm acting at least in accordance with reality rather than this presumed reality that I maintain. So I can recognize the harms done, correct those harms, begin to practice the totality of everything I've learned, and then begin to look at prayer and meditation. And 11 Steps says, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. It didn't say to get a contact, because we're never out of contact with an absolute source. It's beginning to reckon with this fact that we've gone from subjectivity to objectivity and now looked at the whole thing and saying, oh, this absolute source isn't subjective or objective whatsoever. It's just an absolute source. It isn't in the time and space bound dimensional concepts that thinking has about time and space and dimensions and here and there and up and down and in and out and there and then and all that stuff. Doesn't function on that basis, but it always functions presently because there is no other place for it to function. And that's a meditation. And if we have in this 12th step an awakened meditation, because we've had a spiritual awakening, we are awake to the fact that the spirit is absolutely always there. And it's up to each person to decide, because we try to carry a message, we don't carry the message. There's always a receiver in communication, and if they don't want to listen, it's their choice. And if they want to hear what they think, that's their choice. And they will live with those consequences. And none of us are ever going to talk them in or out of it. But we may be better examples for them to look at and say, oh, they don't seem to be doing that thing, without even thinking of it in those words, witnessing it in their experience and saying, oh, there may be a solution here, which is exactly what the book says. Maybe something greater than I'm thinking. And it doesn't have to be in a constructed, defined sentence. And the rest of that is practice principles in all of our affairs. That means 24/7. It doesn't mean that I'm applying my thinking in principled ways. It means the principles are always present, always in the human experience, always present, uninterruptible, undefeatable, immutable, inviolable, just like an absolute state of being is. You can't attack it, but you can think you do. You can't divide it, but you can think you do. You can't have more or less of it, but you can think you do. That's all a function of thought, not reality, not truth. So if we're carrying the ultimate message, it is that there is a solution to the insanity of the thinking that leads to all compulsions and all compulsive behaviors, including codependency and all the other malfunctions. Al-Anon being a perfect example of it. It deals with relationships. Well, my relationship and my qualifier when I went to Al-Anon meetings as a double winner, they call it, because alcohol and Al-Anon are very synonymous with each other in their creation, was my relationship to alcohol. I thought it was my savior. I thought it was my friend. I thought it was my go-to. That's where I went to escape into that oblivion that I thought I was having to make sense of the rest of the world. Well, it was delusional to make believe that I was no longer a part of the world by doing that. So simple concessions. If absolute's absolute, it's absolute. It means no exceptions, no options. And we can't be condemned by having everything. That's interesting. If there's no options and it's simply our state of being, can't be condemned by that. While in the thinking I do that there's no other option, I feel condemned immediately because I'm creating a situation that is untrue as though it's true, and the only thing I can do, which is to be against everything and everyone, including reality and truth, and that somehow I'm going to prevail in that line of thinking. So self-contempt and all that comes out of that thinking. It doesn't come out of knowingness and awareness and absolute states of being, or the absolute state of being. It's all self-imposed, self-driven by a self that is simply imagined to be real. Self-induced, self-imposed. I think the book uses those two fairly clearly and enough. So now is always here, here is always now. It's always okay in the essence. It doesn't mean what we're doing and how we're thinking is okay. And we know when it isn't. We know when we don't feel okay that something is wrong with what's happening. And again, to your point earlier, Gabe, if I can begin to notice what I'm doing, since my experience is central to my experience, I'm the one causing that experience. If I didn't exist, I wouldn't be having it. I may be a knowing being at that point that doesn't have experience, just has an absolute state of being awareness. But if I'm starting to notice what I'm doing, I start to notice the things that are actually happening out there clearer. And I have compassion rather than contempt for the people doing those things. Because now I see it as something identical to what I'm doing and something I have a common bond with, a common nature with, in terms of the nature of that dysfunctional thinking. So I don't see others as doing it to me. I see them as suffering with the same thing I suffer with when I do that thing. So I don't have to blame and fault them to reinforce the idea that I'm right and they're wrong, because I'm no longer seeing that rightness in what I'm doing as right. I'm seeing it as a conflict of wrong, creating it's the idea that wrong is right that I'm conflicted with. So the Alice's looking glass clears up and I start to see things clearly. And there is plenty to be distressed about in that regard. But there's also a much greater sense of possibility by realizing that if we all share this greatness, this great fullness, literally the fullness of greatness, if we all share this, it isn't too hard to talk about it. It's hard to continue to make believe we can't and shouldn't and won't and don't and we'll never do it. I hear it a lot. Well, nobody's ever going to believe that. It's pretty interesting how confident you are in everybody else while actually struggling with your own level of confidence. You flip it around, blow it up in all these different proportions. That's the subjective objective teeter-totter, which we can live in and think that that's all there is when we think that all there is thinking and relative experience. But clearly within even the basic physics today, there's multiple dimensions beyond the third and fourth dimension that we seem to live in, fifth and sixth, that are sixth sense and the fifth dimension being much more integrated at a level of symmetry and synchronicity and simultaneous nature of the present absolutely being with us as us presently. Morning, Mark.
Morning, guys.
So the ultimate concession isn't conceding anything, but starting to see that everything is as it is, regardless of whether I concede it or not. Within the relative, objective, subjective experience, I can think I need to accept things, but if those things already exist, all I'm doing is introducing my thinking to a new way of thinking about those things that I used to think those things depended on my thinking, and I can begin to say, oh, there's actually more going on than what I think. It's just a transition. But if I'm wobbling in that, I'm always going to have stability, instability, stability, instability, stability, instability, kind of wobbling. And not noticing that the fulcrum, which is the center point of any teeter-totter, is barely moving because it's on a stable basis. Every teeter-totter, everything that teeters and totters has to be on a basis that's stable for it to do that. And even that, our world is spinning at, 24,000 miles an hour and orbiting at, I forget what the number is, but in total, it's over 1,000,000 miles an hour when you start to put the galaxy spin and all that in it. And so we're never still. But we seem still because we're moving simultaneous with everything else, and it seems to be still, but yet we're floating in midair, literally held by an invisible force called gravity that keeps things in order, that has its own natural order. And it doesn't say, I want the day off and I can't do it. I can't take it anymore and I'm going to stop. It just continues to do what it does. Plenty of evidence for absolute conditions around us. If we're looking accurately and thinking about it in the simplest way, they become obvious rather than pretending obliviously that ignoring them is somehow going to save us. So it seems like a lot to stomach, doesn't it? This addictive marriage to mentality has created somatic experiences that we think we need to maintain to be safe, to protect against, but they're actually very uneasy, queasy. I call it seasickness. When I began to realize that I felt exactly when I go on a boat, I often get a subtle version of the same nausea that I feel on land that's caused by the nervousness and that movement, that emoting of that teeter-totter. That movement creates that queasiness. Whenever I'm hanging on to something, I feel it as though it's stuck in my body, as though it's a condition that's natural, when in fact it's just a cause of the acids and all the things that are building up in my body as a result of the resistance I'm having to my experience. So it seems preposterous that that tension can go away, because if we've been defining who we are by our thoughts about our thinking, we've been defining the manifestation of those effects in our body, which are tension and stress and anxiety and ailments, as defining who we are also. It's not true. It's just a consequence, a natural consequence that's debilitating because the thoughts are handicapped to begin with. They don't have any legs. They don't have any numerator. They don't have any denominator. It's all numerator acting as though it's something. It isn't. It's imagination being thought of as reality. So the great benefit of imagination is turned completely upside down. Instincts gone awry, meaning they're working in the opposite direction. The thing I do to now save myself is the thing I'm doing to kill myself, because I'm adding more and more and more stress to my body, which it can't, it's not designed to take it. It's designed to let me know when I'm doing it so I can adjust accordingly and begin to right the wrong I'm thinking and as a result doing. So if everything is okay right now, absolutely as it is, because it's happening, we can just concede that, rather than it should or shouldn't be happening and the world would be better if it wasn't happening, all that kind of stuff we concoct. It's happening. We can begin to address it accurately, and as a result, potentially create an influence that resolves things accurately rather than perpetuate them. So how do we talk about that here, since we are here now talking about my experiences? When I talk about those things in the absolute sense, there's very little obsessive thinking going on, because now I'm in that state of wonder and inspiration and expansion and saying, oh wow, there's more, my imagination is tiny compared to the possibilities that I know exist. And pretty soon my imagination becomes a creative force for good, rather than this sort of demonic thing of trying to figure out how to put the fire out that I keep relighting.
Maybe we're all what do they call those people who like fire?
Arsonists, pyromanias.
Pyromaniacs, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think of the that sensation of being in a burning building you want to get out of. But it's not unlike this idea that impulsivity and compulsions are constantly driving us in a direction to try to pretend we can escape where we are while we're always where we are. When it comes to mental issues, where they go with us wherever we go, because they're being manifest in the brain and the body. It's all part of that. It's not some distinct thing that's out there somewhere. The essence of something that isn't bound in time and space isn't somewhere else. It's always present wherever anything and everything is, including those things we don't even consider to be things, space and even gravity. I don't think the actual definition of gravity is a force, but it's called a force, and yet it's recognized as not actually being a force, because they really don't quite understand it, how it works. There's a lot of theories, and it does not seem to be interrupted in what it's doing by all the theories we've come up with, which again shows that thinking is secondary to all this, not primary. And yet thinking is the primary driver of our human experience. So if we're thinking wrong is right, we are absolutely dead set on having an experience that's horrifying and difficult and I would call present traumatic stress.
Thinking can affect all of that, but not reality.
Yeah. Well, it affects our utilization of it as humans. If we think our thoughts are real, then we have literally turned our back on reality, but it doesn't mean reality changes. It means our experience of reality changes, which means we have to begin acting dysfunctionally to prove that we're right. And that, I would say, is the major wrong of humanity. That quote, let me see if I can find it, the Charles Bukowski quote that I sent with the announcement. Said a great problem in our world is that intelligent people are full of doubt while ignorant people are full of confidence. Charles Bukowski. So there's also, I had lunch with a guy yesterday who is up 23 hours a day since he was a kid. He sleeps an hour, is never tired, owns like 20 companies, very, very busy, loves working. He works around the world and is always, his times, because he doesn't sleep, his time schedule is always available when people in other parts of the world are starting their days. He doesn't have to jockey that. He's just always there. He's always available. But he identified something that I'd heard and never put together, which was a condition that I think it was a psychiatrist or a doctor at Chicago called, and I forget the name of it. I'll dig it up. But it's that idea that our conclusiveness is in fact conclusive while it has all these other byproducts, that ignorance by itself, two things. Somebody who is smart versus somebody who is acting ignorant doesn't have the intelligence to notice that they're acting ignorantly. Because if they had the intelligence, they wouldn't be acting ignorantly. So they see their ignorance as intelligence. And that's, I would say, a very good example of making believe that what we think is reality, regardless of the consequences we start to experience once we think those things, because there's inner conflict and emotional turmoil and mental anguish immediately, but we've dumbed down the experience, desensitized our attention to the point where we think it isn't happening. So for something to be happening and we're thinking it isn't happening is what ignorance, the idea of ignoring it, is based in. And I forget the effect. I'll try to dig that up. But it was recognized as something that in humans has been very, very destructive. So what do we do with it here now? If this absolute state exists and we are capable of talking about it, and yet spend most of our time trying to figure out how to get out of the traps that we've set, like that definition of codependency talked about the trap. What would happen if we focused on the consideration of this absolute source as being absolute and started to think of it in those terms to those other thoughts that seem so intrusive, while we would be actually bringing some light to what would otherwise seem dark? In my experience, it literally dispels the rumor that this thing we've been doing obsessively is in fact real. It's just a consequence of an imagined idea, like a dream can seem very frightening, but there's really nothing going on but thoughts in a dream. And if you've ever had the capacity to actually notice that you're in the dream and you can change the dream and the outcome of the dream, It's a very different way of dreaming than thinking the dream is happening despite us and thinking as a result it's happening to us. So the only relief we get is waking up from it. We seem to be able to do that in our sleep state, but don't seem to notice that in our waking state while we're in fact sleeping. Waking up from those ideas while we're awake is saying, oh, that's literally been that has been an illusion imagined to be real, fantasy imagined to be real. That's just a dream. It's a daydream. Very popular. So how do we discuss that openly? What would be some of the approaches we could use to do that?
I mean, there's only one approach, is to talk honestly and accurately about it on our
Very
day,
good.
in our daily lives,
Yeah.
our work, our home, our kids.
So you see the possibility of that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the choice to begin to consider that in our own conversation, because the conversation we've been having with ourself, when you begin to realize that it's really just that we're really just conversing with our thinking, when you start noticing that we definitely have a meditative, contemplative interaction with our thoughts, we're thinking about our thinking a lot. It's primary to our every choice we make. We can begin to notice that we're thinking about our thinking and think of it in those terms, then the conversation we're having can be a conversion, literally, of what we thought was them, someone else, and us, that self we thought was different and distinct, that was us, but not us at the same time, because it acted out of order and seemed to be disconnected and lonely and depressed and all those kind of attributes that we have developed as manifestations of the idea that it's reality. So it really isn't us, but now actually the thing we're doing is thinking about our thinking. And that's a contemplative advantage that we have to begin to qualify our thoughts and decide whether our thoughts are true or accurate enough. And how do we do that? But apply them. And in conversation, we can apply them in open air without having to run the process of elimination down to figure out which works and which doesn't work. We can get a consensus that's accurate because we're simply thinking about thinking. Even if the thoughts are half-baked, we can apply them. And what I learned to do is make a decision about something and live with the decision for 20 minutes or an hour a day. If I was struggling with the decision, I'd just make one and I'd live with it and say, okay, I'm going to pretend I'm doing that. I'm getting the red car rather than the green car. And I'd live with it. And by choosing a side of the fence to be on, I start seeing the other side a little clearer. I bring balance to my thinking rather than think of it as a decision I need to make that's right and end up in that quandary of how I maintain this right decision when my own doubt is telling me I'm not very confident in the decision. So talking about it in those terms, as far as I can tell, or as best I can tell, is actually carrying the message. It's actually what we're being asked to do. And a lot of times we're thinking the message is only helping people do for them, for their own experience, what they're perfectly capable of doing. But we're now subsidizing their crippled, handicapped thinking by doing for them what they're capable of doing and thinking we're the only ones that are going to do it. That's another sick thought about their capacity. And another sick thought about what help is. And enabling is the root of addiction. The idea that we're helping people get better while we're actually killing them is what enabling is about. We're actually developing the theory that they have no better sense of their own but ours, and it takes us because they can't do it for themselves. And that self they can't do it for is probably accurate in the extreme sense, but they're perfectly capable of actually acting on a functional basis. If we were also acting on a functional basis and saying, look, you're going to make choices, live with those choices. You're doing it already. I'm going to give you that freedom. You let me know when you're interested in discussing this further. And that's really what we're doing here. Everyone is thinking what they want, how they want. They're thinking about it as they want, and whether we discuss it accurately or not, openly or not, I would say is dependent on how willing we are to step into that light and start discussing that light and start sharing that light as something we already have, rather than figure out how we can simply manage these individual problems that we have during the week that seem to be ours and not anyone else's. Oy vey.
Yeah.
So the practice is really easy, and yet it seems hard because the commitment that we don't think we have to the self we don't think of as being a defective self, but actually believe in, reveal their backward thinking by thinking talking about nature is hard when in fact talking about things unnaturally as nature is really where the hardness is. It's all flipped. So it's actually easy to talk about this when we talk about it because it's just pure imagination. And if imagination starts to imagine the absolute state of a being nature that doesn't change, what could be simpler? Book says the program is simple. It's not always easy. Bill knew who he was talking about, or two. People who complicate things, come up with new self-centered ideas about it, seemingly self-centered ideas. People who are addicted to that self-centered nature. He got this in the broadest sense, but he struggled with it in the immediate sense. His mission was to create an organization that would survive. We're coming up on 90 years of that survival, which is a pretty good record. That was his job, his mission, and his view and his term, and he did a good job of it to even allow us to begin to get to the root of what he pointed out very clearly, both in the emotional sobriety letter and in his own experience and his own writings that go way beyond the stuff from the grapevine that go way beyond what we often give him credit for. Talking about the principles and the steps being a potential for social engineering. That isn't talking about a few people who happen to be drunks. That's talking about society in general, all societies. Engineering. What's engineering? Fundamental to a foundation that's strong enough to put anything on, any structure. We stand on that solid foundation and act as though it's our own, act as though we're independent of it, act as though it's shaky when in fact it's our thinking about it that's shaky. Nothing can be simpler than something that doesn't change. And yet, when I talk about this often, people say, why do you complicate this so much? But I know that what they're witnessing is a complication of the thinking they're doing about this conversation. Because if it's backward, what they're going to tell me I'm doing is really an admission of what they're doing. And it gives me a chance to notice, okay, they're noticing. They just don't notice yet they're noticing. Just hasn't occurred to them that that is actually what they're seeing through a lens of complication, something very simple. And nothing, it's kind of like a clear piece of glass that you don't even know is there. Easy to walk through it as though it's not there because there's no indicator that you should stop. So when you talk about something that's clear, and I'm not suggesting I talk about this clearly. I'm sure I fail in 100 ways every time we talk about it in some way that I could do better, speak about it better, etc. But what I've learned is that if this basis is shared by all, and I know that it's shared by all, and we know that it's shared by all, I can make that concession and not worry about what people think about what I'm saying, because I'm no longer so invested in having them think like I do and actually step into a conversation that may exceed their bounds and cause reactivity and cause some bitterness and all that kind of stuff and say, okay, that's all right. I can live with that happily. I've been living with it anyhow, making believe it isn't happening. Why not live with it, witnessing it and saying, yeah, it happens. Of course, any reactivity is going to create defensiveness, defiance, denial, delusion. It's all what it's based on. It's based on protecting something. Something that's absolute doesn't need protection, doesn't need defense. Reality does not need to be defended, and it doesn't matter if we do or don't. It stays the same. That's a very interesting concept to introduce to thinking that has been based on thinking all that's happening is what is thought to be happening. And it dissipates that stuff immediately, just like darkness disappears when you turn on the flashlight or the light switch. Doesn't know how to stay. There's no struggle in it. And we're talking about absolute white light. We're not talking about light that seems to be extinguished by darkness when we turn the switch off, because this isn't a man-made thing like electricity, like our version of electricity and lighting and all that stuff that we witness. The sun does not go down, by the way, ever. We go around, we move away from it when we call it setting. We talk about it in terms that serve the thinking we do and not the accurate terms. And it's so obvious that to not mention it is to continue to perpetuate the sort of conspiratorial narrative that we've been speaking of. Like the sun is not out. Sun is absolutely out at night. We are just on the opposite side of the earth. And that's a great example of what turning around, turning our back on things in that metaphoric sense does. Has us think what's behind us isn't there, what's beneath us isn't there, and yet the substance of everything is beneath us. Understanding, substance, beneath our feet. We don't have to see it for it to be there, to have a place for our feet to be that's absolutely stable. And yet we wonder why our steps are shaking and not notice it's our ideas, our thinking about it. So I have another thought too.
Uh-oh.
That I'll Thank
Took
you.
my words exactly.
Well, it's basically the structure of our discussion. We've been doing this as a group for a long time, and I have a lot of discussions during the week with people that I wish afterward I'd have recorded, because they're really fundamental to this discussion, because they're people in the midst of their struggles really looking for an answer. And I'm wondering, now that I can, I don't know if you noticed, but on your telephone, when you're on a call, you can punch a button and record it.
Mm-hmm.
Have you found that, Mark?
I showed it to you.
Thank you. So I guess you know that.
Yes, I found it. Thank you. Sorry for that response.
Yeah, no. I lost where I found that, but I appreciate that insight. So what it led me to was realizing that I can start to record these. Most of the people are happy to have it recorded because they're happy to participate. Record those and upload them during the week. And then once a month, we all get together and discuss the people and the individual things that might be a bit more striking in terms of the experience they're having that we can relate to, so that we can talk as a group about that and start to pull in all these other people. Now, what that leads to in my experience is really also reinforcing the idea to everyone out there listening that you can participate in these discussions. And you don't need to name yourself. We want it to maintain a level of anonymity that really reflects what anonymity is about, which is a faceless, personalist, characterless essence that we all share. That's the essence of anonymity. The idea that we avoid the stigma by not mentioning our full name or our association to any one of the many 12-step groups that ask that we don't identify ourselves or those groups as individuals with first and last names or visually, press, radio, and film, and now internet, means that we are absolutely free to rename ourselves in any name we want, since names are chosen by somebody anyhow. They're not who we are, they're just attachments. And talk openly about our experience. If anyone's out there listening, you're having an experience. If that experience is valuable, being heard by others would also be valuable. And I know that in your own experience, you're having that conversation with someone somewhere, because you can't listen to anything and not be affected by it and have it alter the way you discuss things. It may also seem hard to discuss because it's never discussed openly. And this is one way of actually doing it proactively with people who are active enough with it to sometimes want to discuss it. I know there's a lot of silence at times, but my sense is some of this causes contemplation to start considering things that don't seem probable or possible. And silence is often my experience, people beginning to say, not just knee jerk into a conversation that they're trying to reinforce all the ideas they have about who they think they are, but actually beginning to witness their ability to simply sit and take it in and listen and sit with it and observe it and notice it. And conversation very often follows in ways that are unexpected, because the typical expectation is that it's always going to lead to some form of conflict at some point. So in the broader sense, in the absolute sense, there is no conflict at all. None. We can make it up, for sure. But then all it is makeup, make-believe, fantasy. And we can disagree. And we can absolutely be adherents to the position we take. But for me to take any position is for me to confirm all the other positions that can be taken, rather than to think of it as the only position, which is how it works within the context of this idea of my thoughts being real and myself being based in thought. So it changes dramatically the conversation. Anyway, I'm thinking of doing that. But
And broadcasting it? The phone conversations?
yes,
Seems a little big brothery, but I'm open.
well, these are people who are they're often people in this meeting who are not afraid to have their voice heard on a broader level than the group. I mean, the group here is obviously speaking to an audience that's greater than the group. So, and it wouldn't be something I would do unannounced, just like the intro to this has a very prescribed direction about the fact that we're going to be recording it and that people don't have to use their names, and there's no obligation to speak or share. And there's no requirement whatsoever to come and listen and participate. Your participation is listening whether people speak or not, because there's an inner dialogue going on anyhow. So that's part of that participation, which confirms communication, which always has a sender and a receiver. And
Yeah.
some of those other things for people out there is not addressing people as my mother, my father, but someone in my life, so that we don't assign, somebody happens to recognize my voice and I'm talking about my father, that would sort of assign some potential fault to him that would be undue, because I'm really talking from my experience. It's I may be talking about him, but I don't want him to be the byproduct of it. He's long gone, but there's still lingering ideas and thoughts and things that could be harmful in other people's imagination that I don't want to provoke or promote.
Right.
So
I guess if it's anonymous like that, yeah, that's fine.
yeah,
I'm good. If I got a problem, I'll speak up.
yeah. And it also means that you and I, Mark, I mean, you and I have had some incredible conversations recently, and I think some of them you've even said, I wish we record this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the thing I've started to hear and thought, you know what? Maybe that's the direction here. And then if you're listening to any of them during the month, the 3 weeks or so that they're posted, and I think I could probably do 2 or 3 of those a week, which would give sort of a holographic experience of different circumstances, different voices, ruminating, dealing with the same issues. It might give us a little more to talk about together than on a Sunday morning when, last night we had an hour less sleep and people are thinking about their day and all that kind of stuff. It would be sort of built into the month rather than the immediacy of a conversation that's often hard to stimulate or trigger and sort of create the dynamic that might be more helpful. I don't know. Ultimately it's up to what people think and how they interpret it that makes the impact. But I want to do the best we can to be as vocal about it and open about it and broad about it, so that the opportunity exists in the most attractive way, if it's attractive, So
Yes.
that's my thought. It also takes everybody off the docket for, the weekly thing, which we all do anyhow. I like to talk to you guys all the time or many times during the week. So I may end up having some of the people come in on Sunday, or just publish the weekly recordings on Sunday morning. I think I'll publish them when they're done. I don't think I need to wait for any specific time. But then I could have talks with people during the week who would really like to explore some of their issues more directly. And then we can all talk about it so the discussion extends beyond a one-on-one. I'm very common with the one-on-one. I did it a long time before we started this conversation, which was broader. And I don't know how to start this conversation, so I'm always thinking about how to be more proactive and more engaged in it. And I don't know exactly how to do that. I know what I'm doing. I knew what's been done, and maybe there's some modification that would be helpful in that regard. So this is one of my thoughts.
Yeah, sounds good.
And sit on it too. I want feedback. You know, you'll have little bubbles of ideas and thoughts and stuff, which would be helpful. And again, anyone out there, 24 hours a day, you have access. There's a click button. You can send an email or a phone number or something, and I'll get back to you. Or one of us, I can assign Gabe to start returning calls since he has nothing to do.
I have nothing to do all day.
But to your point, Gabe, another aspect of it that we talked about, when you're focused on something that's functional and you're producing a result, that is the fulfillment of our capacity. It's very fulfilling. So there isn't a lot of room and need for neurosis and worry. All that stuff tends to dissipate. If you're doing something, anything, riding a bike, walking, anything that is intentional in terms of meaning, you're seeing that you're choosing to do that and you're doing that thing. It's very reinforcing. Walking, as a matter of fact, I read or listened to a neuroscientist, what do they call them? I forget the technical name, but he studies the brain. And he said that walking for humans, because it's so fundamental to humanity, being on 2 feet, is one of the greatest ways to reinforce humanity. I thought that's very interesting because within the workout world, they talk about it as being one of the least stressful things you can do. Bill Wilson contemplated while he walked. That was his form of meditation. He didn't sit in the lotus position and try to mimic a guru from India or somewhere else. He simply walked and thought and contemplated and went into nature and walked in the forest. And like Nietzsche used to climb a mountain every day and come back with ideas, inspired ideas, and he'd write. And he did it in a black tuxedo with a top hat. But there are different ways of doing what we're doing. And when we're doing what we're doing and simply conceding we're doing what we're doing, it's very confirming, even when it's wrong, even when it's sick, because we're not creating a conflicted block that gives us the thought or leads to the thought that we shouldn't be doing it, can't be doing it, have to stop doing it, when we're not simply admitting that we're doing it and starting there, letting that be the moment, because that is, in fact, the moment. Everything that's happening right now is already happening. If I think it shouldn't be happening, that is an afterthought to what's happening. If I'm doing it and participating in it, I might as well mention it before I start trying to stop it. Because when I mention that I'm starting it, the absurdity of continuing becomes obvious, and the chance of continuing starts to diminish. So I have nothing to stop when I don't start. It's the same with drinking. It's the first drink, not the 10th drink, that gets us drunk. Same thing with any compulsion. If I'm eating the wrong food and I ate at one of our best local restaurants yesterday, and they had this little fried chicken thing that was so good, and I definitely overate them. Batter isn't good in my system. It doesn't function well, but I tend to get obsessive about things that don't actually work in my system. Almost as though if I don't get enough, I'll never get enough. And the fact is, any of it is no good. It's not enough. It's not going to be enough because I can't get enough in that regard. So it's very addictive, triggering in that regard. Potato chips is another one. So there's points at times it makes no sense. I know better. There's other points if I'm tense and I'm in conflict and I've got stuff going on, all of a sudden those things seem to be obvious go-tos. And what I learned to do is just do them rather than fight the urge. I just do them and live with the consequence to become clearer about both sides of it rather than think I'm going to be able to take a position against it and wonder why I'm now thinking about doing 6 or 8 other compulsive things without even noticing. So anyway,
Thanks, Jack.
any other thoughts?
It's Miller time.
Mark? Mark's he's on a mute. He must be working in the other room. Anyway, love you guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
and
Jack.
we'll continue.
See you around campus.
Bye.